Alright, hi everyone. Welcome to part 1 in my video on future technology. Now, future technology and the changing of technology and technological evolution is something that I've been interested in for a while now. And I just recently saw the documentary called The Transcendent Man by Ray Kurzweil, and it really ignited a spark of interest in my mind. It really did. It really was a very compelling documentary, very dramatic in the way they made it. And that's what I want to talk about, technology, where it's all going, what might happen in the future. And these are just things that, people talk about of, what may happen and what may happen in the future. So now, when you talk about technology, it's interesting to kind of look at history and how technology has grown in the past. For example, before the Industrial Revolution, you would have societies throughout the world that would remain technologically stagnant, technologically the same, on the same level for decade after decade, century after century. You have 1, 2, 3, or 4 centuries where the technology and technological level had stayed the same. You have that throughout history. It's interesting to think about this kind of stuff. You also have civilizations that will be kind of advanced, and then something will happen, sometimes something cataclysmic, where the civilization will be thrown into a dark age. You had that with the ancient Greeks. The ancient Greeks, and most people probably don't know this, but they were actually thrown into a dark age. And eventually they managed to pull themselves out of that, and you had the emergence of classical Greece. But, there was a dark age at one point. And you see this with other cultures and other civilizations as well. Most people are probably familiar with the European Dark Age, and how for centuries there wasn't a whole lot of technological growth throughout Europe. And then later, Europe managed to pull out of that, but for a while, there wasn't much technological growth. Certainly you have that with Russia, where there wasn't a whole lot of technological growth in Russia, and Russia was actually further behind that of Western Europe. And the Russians knew that, and they wanted to pull themselves out of that, so they began to study Western Europe more, and they began to study their technology, and eventually Russia became more advanced. But for a while, it was behind the rest of Europe. And when you're talking about this kind of thing, another interesting nation to talk about is China. Because China is a nation that invented all kinds of things. There's a lot of firsts when it comes to inventions in China. The Chinese invented gunpowder, for example. Sulfur, saltpeter, and charcoal is the recipe of gunpowder. And the interesting thing about that is the invention of gunpowder is actually one of history's great ironies, because Chinese alchemists were looking for an eternal life elixir for the emperor, something that would give the emperor eternal life. And they thought that it would be something chemical. So they began to try to come up with different chemicals, and eventually they didn't come up with the elixir of life, they came up with the elixir of death, gunpowder. So that, that's one of history's great ironies, the invention of gunpowder. Because, they were not looking for something like gunpowder. They were looking for this eternal life elixir, something that would be chemical. Now, today it's been suggested that eternal life could possibly be achieved not chemically, like the Chinese believed, but technologically. And that's certainly something the documentary The Transcendent Man talks about, that could possibly be achieved through technological means. But, just getting back to China, so many, firsts and so many different things that they invented before anyone else did. Another thing they invented was the first gun, which was technically a bamboo pole that shot out a clay pellet. That would be the first gun, technically. But, yeah, a lot of other firsts that the Chinese came up with. The compass, type, printing. They did a lot of exploring in the Ming Dynasty. And, just all sorts of different things being invented. But then all that came to an end in the mid-1600s, around 1644. And China was thrown into a bit of a dark age. They certainly were. From around 1644 to 1805, you did not have a single thing being invented in China. The culture remained technologically stagnant. No one had invented anything new. That's really interesting to think about how that happened and why that happened and how that came about. I know historians have suggested that the reason for that has to do with the fact that China didn't have a lot of powerful neighbors bordering the country. You had that in Western Europe, and that was what made Western Europe so advanced, because you had all these countries in Western Europe competing against one another, and that caused technological growth to happen. But with China, you didn't have that, so they believe that China remained technologically stagnant because there just wasn't that competition from powerful neighbors that you had in Western Europe. So that's definitely something interesting to think about. And I know there's a form of Chinese literature and cinema that you could kind of see this kind of thing, where it usually involves, a hero, and there's different like mythological elements of the martial arts thrown in, and it takes place sometime in China's distant past, although you don't know when. Could be 100 years ago, could be 200 years ago, could be 300 years ago. You don't know when it takes place. But, yeah, and that's how China was. It had just remained technologically stagnant for a long period of time. Now, in this country, things were different because in the late 19th century, you had the Industrial Revolution, and there was this big explosion of things being invented. For example, you had the motion picture camera come into being at around this time. Actually, the motion picture camera was not invented by Thomas Edison. Louis Lee Prince invented the motion picture camera, but Thomas Edison did invent a version of the motion picture camera. And when he came up with his motion picture camera, when he invented it, he kind of thought of movies as being this like, little novelty that would never really take off. Of course he was wrong. Movies definitely did take off. But that's kind of how people think of technology when it happens, when it comes into existence. They sort of look at it as this like crappy little novelty, but then it becomes more and more popular and people use it more and more, and there's more improved versions of it. For example, I remember 20 years ago when I was in college, a professor told the class to, send an email. That the homework assignment was to send him an email message. And I didn't do it. I didn't do it because I thought that email was this crappy little novelty that would never take off. And as a result of that, I didn't send him an email message. And of course, I was wrong in that. But that's just kind of how technology is. Like I said, people see it as this little crappy novelty at first, but then it gains more and more acceptance as time goes on. The internet is another thing. And I remember when the internet came out, the internet was kind of viewed as being inferior drivel. Like the information that you would get off the internet was thought of as being inferior drivel. It was certainly thought of as being inferior to books and book learning. But, that's just kind of how people thought of it at the time. I remember people saying, like, you can't trust the internet. And, nowadays, that's not the case. It's definitely improved a lot, and more people are trusting the internet. There was even this saying that existed about 20 years ago or so, and it was, the internet is like a library if you took all the books from the library and piled them onto the floor in one big pile, because people felt that the internet was just one big jumbled mess. And that may have been true at the time, but that saying is no longer relevant. That's not true anymore. You have search engines, and information is just much better organized on the internet. 20 years ago, if you told somebody you were going to get an education or educate yourself on the internet, they would have laughed at you. Now it's possible to get a university level education on the internet. So many professors have put so much information on the internet that you really have a lot out there at this day and age. There's really a lot of information out there. And Ray Kurzweil talks about all this. He talks about, like I said, technology and changing technology and technological improvements. And another thing that he does talk about is he talks about the singularity. That's something he mentions quite a bit. And the singularity he puts at the year 2029. And that is when computers will become as smart as humans and then exceed humans in intelligence. Now, some people don't like that idea. They just don't like to think of that kind of thing. They're not into that. It's just not something people really want to think about. Computers becoming as smart as humans and then surpassing it, because they see it as being dystopian. This dystopian Terminator scenario where you have something like a Skynet, and who knows if that'll happen. Who knows? Maybe the future won't be dystopian. Maybe it'll be utopian. Who knows? There's no way to tell. But yeah, just a lot of interesting things Ray Kurzweil mentions. He also talks about, cell phones shrinking down and getting smaller and smaller, and then people putting them into their brains and being able to, have the internet in your brain, essentially becoming a cybernetic organism, and you'll have the ability to communicate with people all over the world. That's another interesting thing. Again, I know there's some people that find that very problematic. They don't like the whole idea of that, and that's definitely something that's in sci-fi territory. It really is. But yeah, it is kind of bothersome to some people. But yeah, so with the whole singularity, 2029, some people believe that that's too early. The 2029 is too early. They feel it will happen, but 2029 is just too early. They see it as happening further down the road. And that could be, and it could be that Ray Kurzweil just set it at 2029 because he feels he might still be alive at the time to take advantage of all the wonders that the singularity will provide. So it's very interesting. It's very interesting to think of technology and all the, exciting and scary things that are happening. Where is it all going? So just some fascinating stuff here. I know, if you were to talk to people from the 1980s about drones and explain that, yeah, in the future there will be drones. They'll have these, drones. There will be people from the 80s that wouldn't believe you. But now, certainly we do have drones. So that's an interesting thing to think about. What seems kind of impossible now may, of course, not be impossible in the future. That's definitely for sure. A lot of times when people talk about the future, one thing they always mention quite frequently is Star Trek. And just all the things that have happened with Star Trek, all the, inventions that have been shown on Star Trek that now exist. You know, there certainly are some. I mean, someone brought to my attention that there's an episode of Star Trek The Next Generation where Captain Picard is reading off of a device that looks like a Kindle. You know, so that's interesting, you know, how that is. You know, there's definitely some other interesting things with Star Trek as well. I know I was recently watching a Star Trek episode called Space Seed, and Space Seed deals with genetically enhanced superhumans, and that's something that Ray Kurzweil definitely talks about. This idea of genetically enhancing humans to become much more smarter and much stronger as well. You know, he does mention this in The Transcendent Man, and the Star Trek episode Space Seed explores this idea. The Star Trek Enterprise comes across a spaceship, and aboard that spaceship is a genetically enhanced human by the name of Khan. Now, Khan is 5 times as strong as a human, and he's also much smarter than a regular human. But what had happened was, on Earth they had created these genetically enhanced humans, and they created these genetically enhanced humans to try to solve Earth's problems. But then what ended up happening is these genetically enhanced superhumans wanted to take over. They wanted to control everything. And that's what you had happen here. And it created this huge rift between the genetically enhanced humans and the humans that were not genetically enhanced. And that's talked about a lot in the Transcendent Man documentary, how, you know, there could be a rift between the humans that have been genetically enhanced and the humans that have not been genetically enhanced. You know, and what will happen with that? Well, in the episode Space Seed, the humans hunted down the genetically enhanced humans. However, a few managed to escape, and they built a spaceship and blasted off into space. So, yeah, there's a lot of interesting things, you know, going on here with, you know, technology and the exponential growth of technology. And, you know, Ray Kurzweil definitely, you know, an interesting person. He talks a lot about this, you know. So a little bit about him. I mean, he was an inventor. He invented a number of different things. One of the things he invented was the Kurzweil keyboard. He also invented some other stuff pertaining to, you know, helping the hearing impaired and visually impaired. But, yeah, you know, that's all I have to say right now. Just tune into my next video where, you know, I explore these ideas further and talk more about, you know, future technology and different things that are being invented.